Storytime with Stephanie
Hi,
Storey.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Storytime. I'm very excited for my guest today because we've already had a chance to have a conversation at Six Bridges Literary Festival in Little Rock. Well, it was virtual, but we've already had a chance to do this. We're going to revisit some conversations. She is a fiction writer who has her MFA from Columbia. Her fiction's been nominated for like a Pushcart Prize. She's brilliant. And her debut novel, which came out the same day as my Raphael, is so good. You're going to want to like eat the prose. We'll talk about that. It's called Conjure Women, and it's already been named one of the best books of the year by NPR and Book Riot. Welcome to the show, Afia Atakora.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you so much for having me.
It is so exciting. First of all, I have to say, your book is doing so well. I mean, it's just taking the world by storm, which is sort of awesome. It's your debut.
It's my debut. It's the craziest year to have a debut.
Yes, it is.
I imagine.
It is. It's, oh my gosh. It's not my debut. It's my second. I can tell you this time around was completely different than the first time around. But before we get into the specifics of the book, how has the experience been for you sending your child out in the world and having such great response? I mean, that's amazing.
It's amazing. I mean, I spent about 3 years working on it. So for a while, it was just me and the characters, and now other people know about it. And they're like, what does Rue do here? And I'm like, you know Rue? You've met her? So it's just this amazing thing. It's like, I exist in the world and the book exists. And yet, you know, everything's for a screen. And so it's this crazy, like, dual narrative of me just amazed about how many people it can touch.
As I said during the intro, the prose is phenomenal through the roof, just so you don't have to do your own bragging on your own prose. But I will let you tell the story a little bit to give viewers at home a sense of what the story's about, and then I have questions.
Of course. So I always say Conjure Women is told for this narrative braid of the past and the present being the years just after the Civil War, which I call freedom time, and the years just before the Civil War, which I call slavery time. And so in Conjure Women, we meet Rue, who is a young midwife and healer on a former plantation made up of recently freed slaves. And so she's she's the healer, she's the midwife, she's that sort of all-purpose mystery woman, but also she has this sort of antagonism towards her role because her mother was also the Conjure Woman before her. And so we see in slavery time, we see sort of Miss Maybelle, who's Rue's mother on the plantation, sort of raising Rue and teaching her to take on this task in a world that is swiftly changing. And so Rue, as an adult, is faced with these crazy challenges, one being the birth of a strange black-eyed child, another the arrival of a mysterious preacher, and then a strange sickness that is sweeping through the town and causing fears of witchcraft against Rue and her abilities. So it's a lot. There's a lot going on, and a lot of it is kind of synonymous with our times, which is scary because I did not know that it would come out during a pandemic about healing and sickness and how we deal with being in a crazy time in history. And so it's been wild.
It is so true that it did make me think about our own crazy, tumultuous era in a way. That's what I was going to ask you about when you were talking about other people, other readers reaching out to you about the book and their take. Has any of their take or the way this book has been received in this moment been surprising to you or changed the way you saw your own book? Do you know what I mean? Like, that's a crazy big question, but do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like this moment had to have changed the experience of this book. Do you know how and what that's been like, or have you heard?
Yeah, because I always said, I mean, I think writing historical fiction, you always want it to be this sort of present experience, right? You don't want it to feel like you're writing about these dodgy characters in a history book. You want them to feel present, right? You know all about this stuff. And so in a way, my approach was, okay, they don't know they're living in a crazy time in history. They're ordinary people. They have their own, fascinations and their own obsessions in their daily life. And so that was something I really wanted to infuse the novel with, not realizing again that we would be living in a crazy time in history. And we have that awareness too. And I think that's something that readers have reached out about, is just sort of the the sense that you can live in a historical crazy time and also sort of still be concerned with your daily life, with your neighbors, with your, identity and things like that. And so I think it's amazing that it sort of resonates with people in that way.
Did you learn, this is going to sound crazy, but did you learn anything? What did you, I think you always learn something about yourself when you're writing a novel. I would hope so.
Yeah.
So what did you learn about yourself or your family or this country or any of those things while writing, while putting the story together?
Yeah. I think, I thought at least that I would, do all this research and it would be this sort of separate art piece away from me. And yet you put so much of yourself into it without even realizing. And one thing that sort of happened in the book, there's a lot, as I said, about Rue sort of learning from her mother, who was midwife before her, and sort of observing her in the community. And I sent it to my editor and we were working through those scenes and she's like, you have kind of an obsession with this mother-daughter dynamic and this healing dynamic. And she's like, what is that about? And I said, oh, I forgot when I was a kid that my mother was a live-in nurse and a visiting nurse. And sometimes she would take me with her, she didn't have childcare that day. She'd take me with her and I'd sit in the living room of these strangers and sort of observe her working. And I never thought of that as sort of a formative experience. I almost forgot about it. And yet it was coming through in this book about healing and about what do you learn from your mother and how do you observe who she is and make decisions about who you want to be later in life. And I had no idea that I was putting that in the book.
That's fascinating that this shows up in this novel as this healing piece and that you watched your mother healing people. And then this book comes out at this moment during this medical crisis.
Exactly.
Your book has some superstition and magic in it, but there is a bit of magic about how that all comes
right.
full circle.
Right. And I think the book is a lot about those things that sort of come back in your history and the sort of repeating cycle of the characters and their memories. And so it is wild. It's
wild. Okay, when I was reading your book, I was thinking a lot about Gloria Naylor's Mama Day. It was one of my favorite books.
Yes.
20 years ago, profoundly. I was like, oh my gosh, this I understood. I got the magical realism and it was also about a healer and it was about anyway, I say that because I'm wondering, your book feels so unique to me in so many ways, in the greatest way. But who were your personal writing influences? Who did you look at and you go, ooh, this is sort of what I'm trying to do, or this is what I'm sort of trying to do? Or do you have those people that you sort of aspire to be and you're sort of rummaging through their books looking for how they do things well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the book is definitely in conversation with all that sort of that history of magical realism and sort of oppressed peoples in the way that magic sort of gives them strength or gives them control over their lives. I felt like that was a fascinating sort of thing that I kept seeing in these magical realism books about, a crazy animal runs through the forest and what does that mean to these people? You think of Marquez, you think of Toni Morrison, absolutely. One sort of formative, I think, right before I started writing Conjure Women, I had read Kindred by Octavia Butler, which, if you're not familiar, it's sort of like a woman in the 1970s, actually, sort of time travels to the South during slavery. And of course, she's Black and she's confused for a slave. And it's this sort of time travel, science fiction, historical fiction hybrid. And I think for me, that was eye-opening that you could sort of have science fiction and magic and still deal with these sort of heavy historical topics and still have a lens to put that through that felt new and exciting and could speak to some of the images in new ways. And so that for me was really important in writing Conjure Women, was sort of how can I talk about these things that we're all kind of familiar with and put them in a lens that might renew the conversation and renew how we view history, especially uncomfortable history.
It's sometimes hard to look back at the Civil War era because it is this huge, awful mark in our history, and it all deals with the history of slavery in this country, and we all have to contend with that. And I think there are a lot of people contending with that anew right now.
Right.
What did you go about? So what got you interested in re-looking at that time period for you personally, and what did you feel like you were bringing to it? Because anytime you write a book, I think you feel like I got to be bringing my own perspective to this, or why am I writing it? What got you interested in that period, and then what new perspective did you feel like you were bringing to this giant moment in American history that impacts so much?
Yeah, I think for me, just when I started researching the Civil War, it was not to write a novel. It was just to figure out what did slavery look like? What was life like for those people in more of a sort of day-to-day aspect, again, sort of seeing who they were aside from the bullet points in history. I think I had this overview. I think we all kind of have this overview, and we have these images, you think of like Roots or, Civil War films, and you sort of have this very simple, okay, the Emancipation Proclamation happened and the slaves are freed and everything is fine. We have that sort of, that rhetoric in America, I think. And so for me, just as a Black woman is being younger at that time, I really wanted to understand what that meant and what it was really like. And so I just wanted to dive into and being a history nerd as well, and just loving stories and loving exploring those little twists in history. So I began from there, and then later on, I got my MFA at Columbia, and I was sort of trying to figure out what I wanted my thesis to be. And I knew I wanted to write about this strange sort of birth, this midwife and the child with the black eyes and this sort of magical world. And then it seemed perfect to place her in this time when so much was changing. So the book originally was supposed to be set very strictly in the Reconstruction era, which is a 10-year period right after the Civil War, where sort of, again, the slaves were freed, and yet what freedom did they have? What choices could they make? Where could they go? Would they stay? Would they leave? What did it mean to suddenly be a free person in a world that had never taught you that you would ever be? And so with all those questions, I thought, what a perfect place to set a young woman who's also trying to find herself and decide what she can be, and has these lessons from her mother that she doesn't know what to do with in a changing world. And so those two things kind of locked on for me to just sort of explore what it meant to be both Black and a young woman, and trying to find myself, and writing my first novel. So it all clicked.
You said you were a history nerd. We share that.
Yes.
Yes, I'm a total history geek. One of the hardest parts I think about writing historical fiction, it's not, I don't really have everybody always asks me, oh my gosh, how do you do all the research? How do you organize it? I'm like, I get that. The hardest part to me, because I love all that, like that's like the geek out part. I'm like, oh, I can organize research forever. Like, this is great. How did you decide what to cut? Which parts not to use? Because that's the hard part to me.
That was an exercise in absolute restraint, because I had so much, and I think I still have so much on the cutting room floor, as it were, of like great scenes. I'm like, oh, I want to explore this. And again, this is a rich time in history that I don't think we've actually seen a lot of. We have these images, and yet I think it's 200 plus years of history. There's so many ways to tell the story of enslaved people. And there's so many aspects that I wanted to explore. And I think, it was an exercise in, okay, what does this story need? What does Rue need in this place and time? And sort of cutting down a little bit. And I probably could have cut down more, because it's a pretty big book, but cutting down a little bit and just exploring her and her mother and the relationships within the community that made sense. But I always say it's a composite of the South rather than a specific place. And so I got to pull in a lot of different details and sort of steal a little bit of Texas history and a little bit of Florida history and a little bit of Georgia. And that's how I kind of got away with with that. That's the fun part, I think, about historical fiction too, right? You have some leeway to interpret these scenes and these moments. And I would take maybe one character that didn't exist in that particular time period, or one figure that didn't exist in that time period, and say, okay, now they lived 10 years earlier, and this is what they might have experienced. And I feel like that's fun, that you get to kind of play with the facts a little bit and tell a story.
I always think it's fun that you serve as a historical fiction writer. You get to make your own choices about how much artistic license to take or how close to the historical fact and how much you're going to sort of slide this down the
Right.
timeline to make it hit that climax a little bit better or whatever your choices are going to be.
Hmm.
Um, so you obviously enjoy that. Where do you fall on that? Keeping really close to the fact versus putting vampires in 1700 New Orleans or whatever, whenever Anne Rice did that. I mean, there's this range in historical fiction between really adhering directly to only what's in the historical record and taking extraordinary liberty all the way on the other end. Where do you
Yeah.
fall on that
You
range?
know, I love vampires in New Orleans, right? Like I think that if you go for the history enough, you can find that little detail. And I think that's where I end up, right? I'm like, okay, if I can do enough research and find that one article that says, oh, there might have been a vampire that walked by, like as long as I can find that little nugget of something that I can sort of flourish and say, look at this pinprick in history. I think that I'm allowed to embellish a little bit.
Give me the overview of what your writing career was, how you got to coming out with a novel, how you finally got to that process. Like, did you write when you
Yeah.
were little? I know you have your MFA, but give me an overview of what your writing journey was.
Yeah, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. Aside from, as we talked about before, off camera, an astronaut, which didn't work out. I, aside from that, always wanted to be a novelist. As soon as I understood that books were written by people, I was like, I want to do that. And I wrote little stories all the time, and I'd be in math class and writing like little poems in the margins of learning math. And so I did everything that I could to sort of go in that direction. And then when it became time to go to college, I was like, eh. um, I wanted to write a book, but I also had this like passion for television. I think it was, sort of a golden time for television and film. And I was like, I want to sort of lean into that and lean into the sort of the collaborative aspect of storytelling. And so I actually studied screenwriting at NYU for my undergrad, which was amazing. I loved it. And I feel like I learned so much about storytelling from so many angles, and so much that again shows up now. But then I finished getting my undergrad, and I was like, okay, it's hard to get an actor, and it's hard to get a director, and it's hard to find a producer, and you know, um, get things greenlit and all of that. And I thought, okay, let me go back to my roots. Let me just sit down and write something that is, 100% me in my crazy head, and really have it rely on the words and the language, as you said before. I think the fact that the novel was the medium was really important to me as well. And so it was about the prose and all of that, and going back to those sorts of roots. And so I decided to get an MFA and sort of have a bit more of an experience in the great books, and try to get back to that, since I didn't have like an English undergrad experience, and really sort of root myself in writing for a few years. And Conjure Women is what fell out.
Um, okay, so since we both have the Hollywood background, and we had sort
Mhm.
of talked about this at Six Bridges, what did you take for? Like, I still use screenwriting techniques. Like, I still use 3x5 cards on a wall and move them around, much like you do in a screenplay
Right.
when you're writing screenplays. I still do that old school thing because I came up with the screenwriting
Mhm.
thing. What did you bring from the screenwriting and the filmmaking and thinking about the world that way that you still apply to your writing process now?
Yeah. I think one big thing is sort of the voices. Conjure Woman is told from a lot of different voices, and I think I felt very flexible and sort of being like, and now we're in this person's perspective, and this person's going to give you a monologue and speak, directly to camera. I think that style is definitely in there, where sometimes I wouldn't use the prose at all. I'd just use the dialogue. And then another thing, and sort of, I think, just structuring the novel plot wise, was I always say you have to work towards the prom at the end of the movie. And so I think writing, I was always like, okay, there's got to be this sort of this climax in all these little stories, because the book again sort of functions in these little stories, but what is the prom? What is everyone sort of gearing up towards at the end of the year? And so I think just those sort of structural storytelling elements really sort of formed, they helped me too, because it was my first novel. I think they helped me sort of have direction and know what I wanted to do and still be sort of experimental and flexible and change up the form a little bit, I think.
Yeah, screenwriting does give a nice foundational structure because it just
Right.
gives you that story structure that you sort of have to stand on. I mean, once you get rid of the this has to happen on page 12 and whatever, you know.
Exactly. It was a way to sort of flip back and forth between the two, I think, which is something I always had done as well. Was sort of, okay, I'm struggling with this scene. Let me try to write it in prose, or I'm struggling with this, little short story. Let me change it into a short film and see what that looks like. And I think that also was a really helpful sort of exercise in thinking.
Yeah, no, I love that. I didn't do it as much when I was a screenwriter. I never sort of went, oh, I guess I'll write this as prose. But now that I write prose, I do sometimes go, well, what would this scene look like if I were screenwriting it?
Right. And I think the different limitations as well bring out different things. I didn't do much in the way of playwriting, but I always loved the sort of like, how do you move the set and make it seem like part of the story? And I think those limitations are so helpful in like rethinking and reevaluating what the scene can be.
Yeah, I love boundaries of things.
Yes.
If you have to play on the field, you have to keep these things going. I love that stuff. And noveling does not have as much of that stuff, but historical fiction does, because you still at least have
Yes.
to keep your timeline, and you got to hit certain things. Even more when
Exactly.
you're jumping back and forth, you've still got to hit certain points in the story where it happens. That gives you
Right.
boundaries.
And I think the interesting thing about historical fiction too is people aren't really, your readers aren't coming in completely blind, right? You're creating a world, but they have their expectations, they have their favorite, moments, they have their best Civil War battles that you sort of have to nod to. Um, and so I think there is that sort of like creating for the audience a little bit, and the expectations of the time, and how do you play with that?
Your first book did well. Happened with me with Oil and Marble. I thought no one would read it. I thought, my
I've
mom and her book club would read it.
mm, I didn't think
And
my mom.
then,
I was like, can you please read my book?
right? And then people read it and
Hmm.
people review it and they love it and they get a little bonding with you. Is that scare? It freaked me out. I went into like metaphorical child's pose for like a year. It freaked me out. Did it freak you out? Are you good with it? Are you embracing it? Or is
I
it
think it's a
daunting?
little bit
Is
of
it okay?
both. And okay, one, again, crazy time trademark. A lot of a lot of the ways that I get to meet people are through screens, and so that creates sort of a distance. And so I miss people and readers. But I will say it's crazy to meet people again that sort of live in your head, right? They're like, I'm like, why do you know Rue, and why do you know Miss Maybell, and why do you sort of have this intimacy of things that I imagined? And so it is this crazy thing where it's like you put your whole identity on the page, and people are like, I love it, and you're like, oh, please keep loving it, please.
So now you're writing another one.
I'm writing another one.
You said a little while ago that, well, it was my first novel, so I got to sort of stand on this kind of, structure. And I guess what is changing about your writing process between debut and novel number two?
I think the fun thing for me at this stage is putting them together as sort of looking at, okay, I made one piece of art. What does this other piece of art say about the first piece of art? And they're not continuous or related in any way, but yeah, it's like, okay, your second book, what does your second book feel like as an author? Um, the second one is historical fiction as well, and yet it's looking like it's going to be set in the 1920s, and so it's a little bit more fast paced. And how does that sort of balance with what I've already written? And so I feel like that's, for me, pretty exciting, is sort of re-envisioning what I do, or defining maybe for the first time what I want to be as an author. I think is
Have you
fun.
figured that out? What you want to
No.
be as an author? What you think you're writing about in the big letter A about?
No, absolutely not.
Do you think you ever figured that out, or is that just like a ever?
I was hoping you would tell me. I was hoping you'd be like, you'll get it. We'll figure it out.
No, I think I'm writing the third one now. I'm like, I don't. It's completely different. I don't know what I'm supposed to be writing. I think this is what I in general write about, but who knows? It always changes.
Yeah. But I mean, I think the historical fiction again is something I love playing in those times and in those facts, and expanding on what I think a certain era might be. And so that for me is the through so far.
What last thing? I have no idea why I'm asking this. I've never asked you. What's your favorite part of writing novels, and what's your least favorite portion?
Oh my gosh. I really like the blank page. I really love just like being on the word processor and it's blank and that thing is flashing and you're like, okay, there's so much possibility here. I could write something really exciting that I really love. That's my favorite part. I hate editing. I hate when I have to figure out how to make this make sense. I already wrote it and it doesn't, and that character should do this thing and they have to open a window, but I forgot to have them open a window. That makes me crazy.
We are the exact opposite.
Oh no.
The blank page, I'm like, I don't know what to put down, but if I could just put something down, then I can edit it and make it good.
Oh my gosh. I wish. I feel like once it's down, it's like set in stone and I'm like, oh no.
Okay, this was a fabulous conversation, and I could talk to you forever because I feel like every time something comes up, I'm like, oh, we have that in common, or like that last one, like, oh, that's the exact opposite, but it's sort of funny that it works that way. Congratulations on
Thank you so
your
much.
debut novel coming out, and you're doing so well, and people loving it. It really is. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece of writing. So congratulations on that. I absolutely wish you all the best on the planet and putting another one out. And that's so exciting that you're writing another one and you're squirreling away
it's
on
absolutely like this. That's how I write.
Do you think you're a fast writer or a slow writer? I take 300 years between novels.
I think
you're
I'm
going to crank
slow.
them out or slow?
Well, I think that's the thing about the blank page. I have so many ideas that I'm like, I can't wait to get to. And then once I'm doing it and once I'm editing, it gets slower there. But I think fast.
Okay.
We'll
okay, good. So we're going to see a lot of these books. This is excellent.
I hope so.
All right. Thank you again for joining me. It was a
Thank
lovely
you
conversation.
so much, Stephanie.
Beautiful book. Everybody at home is going to buy it and they're going to love you for it. Yeah. Okay. See everybody
Flash it on
Hold it up. I will keep pretty still. We will linger on it, but please, I love it.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. And see everybody else next time. Bye.
Stephanie, story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie, story.